Hello, this is Michel Leviathan Sorbet and this is a new episode of Wojennik TV. At the beginning of the 90s, when the USSR had been dissolved, many people believed that Russia will enter a period of peaceful and democratic transformation. The early years seemed to confirm such a tendency, but then the old tensions between the West and the East began to resurface once more. Thanks to a game published by Phalanx in 2019, which is called Europe Divided, we can recreate this new Cold War which started at the early 90s and which really is still going on right now. This is a game for two players. One of them will take control of the European Union and of NATO, while the second will take control of Russia. Both players will compete in order to obtain dominance over Central Europe and the Caucasus. Both players will have asymmetrical assets in the form of different card decks, in the form of dice which they will be placing in countries in order to indicate their influence in those regions. This is a game designed by two very well-known designers, by David Thompson and Chris Marling. David Thompson is, for instance, the designer of Pavlov's House or Castle Eater, so as I said a few moments ago, a very well-known designer. A game for two players, sometimes referred to as the new Twilight Struggle or the new Cold War. This is an interesting title which I would like to show you today. So now let's take a brief look at the elements and the components of Europe Divided. Then I'll also explain how the game works, and at the end I will give you my final opinion. I will underline the strong and also the weaker points of this title. So let's begin.
Here is Europe Divided. At first, let's take a look at the elements that we will be using while playing this game. So, the first element that we receive is, of course, the board. This is, as you can see, a square board, a mounted board, depicting Europe and also a part of the Caucasus, where the rivalry between Russia and the European Union will also be taking place. Now, this is Europe, but not divided into countries, because in some places we have regions or we have countries which were put together into one space. For instance, we have a huge space, the Eastern Balkans or the Western Balkans. We have still Czechia and Slovakia together. We have the Benelux, so we have the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg. Together we have Portugal and Spain, etc. So some spaces are being merged together, whereas in Russia, as you can see, we have districts. So for instance, the Northwestern Federal District, the Central Federal District, Moscow, etc. So the board is divided into three distinctive parts. The green part, which is Western Europe, and also Turkey, which is a part of NATO, is controlled by the Western player. The red part is Russia, divided into its districts, and finally the central part, the Central Europe and also the states in the Caucasus, Georgia, Azerbaijan and Armenia, are the places which will be the arena of the struggle between those two powers. So our main objective will be to try to gain as much influence as possible in those Central European states and at the same time to score victory points. Those victory points will be accumulated during the game and they will be added on this track. As you can see, those countries or those regions are also bordering one to another, and those borders matter because in this game we will be able to move our armies. Both sides will have their own armies. The red ones will be obviously the Russian armies, whereas the blue ones will be the NATO armies. Now, the Western player will be playing two types of pieces. He will be playing the yellow pieces, which will represent the European Union, and the blue pieces, which will represent NATO. Of course, the armies will be only NATO forces because the European Union still has no army on its own. But those two armies, NATO and Russia, will be able to clash, not maybe in the direct sense of this word, because there won't be any pitched battles, there won't be any declared war, but those forces, those military forces will be able to eliminate one another and to help us to gain influence in some regions, because the main objective will be to gain influence, and this influence will be tracked using dice. We get a lot of dice in Europe divided in 3 different colors. The red ones will be used by the Russian player, the blue and the yellow ones will be used by the European player. And as you can see, it is absolutely possible for the European player to have 2 dice in the same region, because that means that both the European Union and NATO are influencing this region and have some influence in it. Each player has a set of his own dice, a set of his own army counters, and they will be placed on the board. Now those dice won't be rolled, they will be placed on the board, and they will indicate the influence of our power in a region. It can vary from 1, which is a very weak influence, but it is better than none, and 6, which is the maximum possible influence. Now, this is important because having a big influence, 5 or 6, enables us to obtain a bonus in the term of having 1 additional card added to our deck. Because in Europe Divided, we will be using cards, and each side will have their own set of starting cards, which will be, as you can see, red for the Russian player and blue for the European player. Now, those cards will represent different regions, different countries, or for instance, as you can see, media or districts in the case of Russia. And those cards will have a certain list of actions which will be possible to be done during our turn. I'll explain it in just a few moments. But as you can see, we have also a second type of card. Those are the cards which at the game start are not part of our deck. Those cards can be added to our deck if we obtain an influence of 5 or 6 in the corresponding region. So for instance, if the Russian player manages to put a die with a 5 or 6 on it in Azerbaijan, he'll be able to get this card and to add it to his or her deck. So then, when this card, firstly put onto the discard, then is being reshuffled into the deck, is again drawn, we'll be able to use it. So we begin the game with a deck composed of 7 cards when it comes to Russia and 14, as I believe, when it comes to Europe. But then this deck can be increased in number of in the term of the number of cards in it by controlling regions. The cards will be used during our turn, but they won't be just played from our hand. At the beginning of each turn, we will be choosing 2 of those cards in order to use them during our turn and to make the actions associated to those cards. Now, those actions will, as I said earlier, be mostly done in order to increase our influence in the regions of Central Europe and in the Caucasus in order to gain points, because we will be gaining points by scoring headlines. We get a second type of cards, those are the bigger cards. Each player will have a certain number of those cards in their hand. They will be discarding, drawing new headlines during the game, and during certain turns, which are indicated on the turn track, as you can see, we will be also scoring the 2 headlines which are in the center of the space of the board. So when we reach such a turn, of a scoring, we will be verifying if the conditions described on the headline card were accomplished. For instance, for this card, for the Russian player to gain 2 victory points, he would have to possess an army in Moldova and also to have an influence larger than NATO in this country. As you can see, those headline cards have some prerequisites, a certain number of victory points, and also a description of the historical events which took place in this region. Some headline cards will be associated to the same region. For instance, we have multiple cards associated to Ukraine or Belarus, but they can work differently. Now, those cards are separated into 2 types, first level and second level cards. At the game start, we'll be using first level cards, which will grant us 1-2 victory points, but then we'll gain access to the second level cards, which, as you can see, can give us even more points, but accomplishing them is sometimes much harder. For instance, here, for the European player, he'll have to get more influence points both in Eastern Balkans and in Hungary, and those influence points have to be European Union points. So if he even has a die associated to NATO in Eastern Balkans or Hungary, it won't be sufficient. You do have to have a yellow die. Now, how a turn of Europe Divided looks like. I said a few moments ago that we will be choosing 2 from 4 of our cards which we have at the beginning of each turn in our hand. And choosing those cards, especially when it comes to the European player, as you can see, will be quite important, because the European player has 2 sets of dice and he has to put 2 sets of dice in order to accomplish some objectives. And as you can see, some cards will enable us only to use NATO actions, others only European Union actions, others will enable us to do both. So we'll have to carefully choose and plan how to use those actions. Now, each player chooses 2 of those cards, and when both are done, they declare the sum of the numbers which are at the bottom of those cards. The player who has the biggest number, the biggest sum, will be playing first. In case of a tie, it's the European player who plays first. Now, what can we do with those cards? When it is our turn, we can do several actions, which are all described on the card. The first most obvious action will be to get some money, because we will be using money in this game in order to pay for some actions. Now, those money tokens, as you can see, are double-sided. They are both euros and also the Russian currency. And in order to do some actions, we'll have to pay for them. For instance, the first action on this card is to place a new influence die for the cost of 2 units of money. So we'll have to pay 2 coins, and we can place a new influence die in one of the contested regions. For instance, we can place a new yellow die in Czechia and Slovakia. A die is placed always on its one side, but using another action, which is just below, we can increase its value by the number indicated on the card. So, for instance, if I place this die using Austria, because I can use then Germany in order to increase the value of this die directly to 5, so +4 thanks to Germany. 5 is good because it enables me to look for the card of Czechia and Slovakia from my reserve and add this card to my deck. So I would be able to put it into my discard and then use it when drawn again. Well, it's both an advantage and a disadvantage, because as you can see, it gives us a palette of new actions, but at the same time, it also sometimes is a weak card, which is weaker than the starting ones. So our deck will be deteriorating through time, and it is important to find a certain balance between putting new dice and acquiring new cards. If our opponent has a 6 die in a region, we cannot increase the value of our own die to 6, because this is forbidden. We cannot increase it as long as our opponent has a 6 in a region. So how to get rid of an opponent's 6? Well, we can use our armies. They are just for that. When an army is being moved thanks to an action, thanks to the movement of an army action, which is also one of the actions possible on some cards, we can destroy an army. Those armies can be moved for free by one region. Each additional region will cost us 1 coin. So for instance, if I wanted to reach Belarus, I would have to pay 1 coin. By moving into a region where an opponent has an army, I just make an exchange, so both armies are discarded. So as in Belarus we still have a Russian army, we won't be able to destroy this 6 die. But if those armies were absent, moving such an army would decrease such a die to 5. The army would also disappear. But it is possible, first of all, using our first action to move our die, to move our army in order to decrease the value of a die, and then use another card to increase the value of our die to 6. Now it's our opponent who cannot increase the value of this die as long as we have this 6 die in this region. We can build new armies using additional actions which are also present on some cards. Finally, we can use special actions which are more often present on Russian cards. They are indicated by this folder, and they enable us to do the action described on a card. Some cards also have a reaction capacity, so if we use them, our opponent can use the reaction ability. Some of them have an effect, which means that if we use such a card, we can also activate it for its effect. We do have also a set of one additional type of cards, and those are the advantage cards. Each player receives a set of those cards at the game start, then he receives additional ones in the middle of the game, and those are special cards which can be used in 3 ways. We can play this card for its effect during our turn, in addition to the 2 cards that we are using in standard in our turn. Secondly, we can just cash this card for 2 coins. And finally, we can keep this card until scoring for 1 victory point. Scoring occurs during turns in which we have the information that a headline will be resolved. So for instance, in turn 4 we'll be resolving headlines, and we will be verifying the headlines in the center of the board. Then also on turn 6, on turn 8, on turn 10, but here we have one additional scoring which occurs in the middle of the game and also at the game's end, so after turn 20. This additional scoring will grant us additional points for having dice with a value of 6 on the board. So for each such die, we'll get 1 additional prestige point added to our score. So it is absolutely important to secure some places in order both to score headline points, as also to score bonus points for having those 6s on the board. And those are pretty much all the basic rules which govern the play of Europe divided. Now there are some additional subtle rules. For instance, the European player has to be careful when using cards from contested regions, because if he acquires such a card by placing a 5 or 6 die on the board, then he can use such a card when redrawing it only if he still has sufficient influence in the region. So if his influence is decreased in Czechia and Slovakia and we draw this card, we will draw dead. We cannot use it because it is compulsory to have a certain amount of influence in the country from which this card was taken. This doesn't apply to the Russian player, who in general is more flexible, who has a smaller deck but of powerful cards. So The Russian player will be playing pretty fast. He'll be very effective. The European player has a great potential, but at the same time, his weakness is sometimes the time of regaining a card, because his deck is bigger and he also has to focus both on upgrading his NATO and European Union forces. Now, I would like to briefly tell you what are my feelings about this game, what are my thoughts after plays, what I think are the strong and a little bit weaker points of Europe Divided.
Europe Divided is a game which is often referred as to the new Cold War game, as the new Twilight Struggle. And this is due to two factors. The first one is because of its subject. This is obviously a game which concentrates on the struggle between the Western and Eastern world, between NATO and the European Union on one hand and Russia on the other. The second aspect is that this game is somewhat a continuation of what Twilight Struggle simulates, because Twilight Struggle ends somewhere in the late 80s, and some players playing Twilight Struggle, who like Twilight Struggle, sometimes might wonder what happened next, how the world would look like if we continued our game. Well, Europe Divided in some way gives us the answer. It enables us to recreate what happened later, when many people believed that Russia entered this democratic transformation period, and when the tensions between the West and the East seemed to diminish. Well, the years later showed us that those tensions were still there, and they are still here when I'm making this video, because the game ends in 2018, as I believe, but it could still be enhanced with additional events, with additional cards showing us what happened in 2019 or even in 2020. So why not an expansion in some time? When talking of strong points of Europe Divided, I cannot not mention that this is again a game with very high quality components. Again, because Phalanx is a gaming company which publishes really very high quality games. I loved U-Boat, I loved the new editions of Brass. They are such pretty games. They are games filled with such high quality components that the standard of the games published by Phalanx is extremely high, and Europe Divided is absolutely not an exception. You receive high standard cards, you receive dice, you receive a very pretty map board, and everything is just great. One thing which could be done, in my opinion, a little better is the Caucasus region, but to be precise, this doesn't concern the quality of what you receive. It is somewhat related to the functional aspect of the map board, because in my opinion the Caucasus region is just too small. The Armenian, Georgian and Azerbaijan regions are just too small to store everything that is put onto those regions during games, because sometimes you'll put 3 dice, 1 European Union, 1 NATO, 1 Russian dice, and also an army, and there is no place to put all those things in Armenia and to still see the borders, or not to be unsure if the dice placed in this region are still in Armenia or in Georgia. In my opinion, this region, this part of the board, should be bigger, or it should be placed elsewhere. It could have been, for instance, placed in the lower left corner of the board, where there is still place to put additional things. This small sector is additionally placed on the corner of the game map, so sometimes it might happen that a player will, for instance, displace the dice or move them, because this is just the border, this is the edge of the map board, and in my opinion it is not very functional. But I'd like to return now to the strong points of the game, because as I mentioned earlier, I would like to start by the strong points. The thing that I believe is one of the most obvious but also the most important strong points of this game is its asymmetrical aspect. This is a very asymmetrical game. Both sides work in a very different way. They receive different assets. They have different cards in their decks with different actions on them. They have very different financial potentials, because the European Union is rich. You have a lot of money to spend. At the same time, you'll have to play with two sets of dice. You'll get the blue dice from NATO and the yellow dice from the European Union. And it won't be easy to put those dice in such a way to obtain the advantage required to accomplish some objectives sometimes. You'll need, for instance, even having a blue 6 in a region, still put a yellow die in order to score a region. The Russian player has just one set of dice, but at the same time he has a lot. He has a lot less money to spend, because even on his cards he has cards which grant him less money than the European player can gain by playing his action cards. Both players have also different advantage cards, which are another strong point of this game, which I really like. Those advantage cards are very, very powerful, and they can be used in three ways. You can play them for their action, you can keep them in order to score a point, or you can also use them to gain money. And all those three uses are extremely powerful. Sometimes looking at the board, looking at the amount of money that your opponent has, and on the headline cards which are awaiting scoring, you might feel that you are able to calculate precisely what your opponent is able to do and what he can't do. Well, those advantage cards can change everything, because suddenly a new Russian army appears on the Black Sea. Suddenly the European player has three additional coins which he didn't have a few moments earlier. So those advantage cards, I really love them, because they can be a game changer. They are an extremely important aspect of the game and a very clever addition. I like the way that the game tells us the story of the new Cold War, because this is a game which has for its purpose to show us how the new Cold War looked like. And in my opinion, this story is valid. It is well told. You get several elements which enable you to recreate this struggle between Russia and Europe, because you get the headline cards with the events, not only with the information about how much points you get, but also describing you the events which took place in for instance 2008, 2010, showing you the impact of those events on the situation in Europe or in the Caucasus. You get also the reaction mechanics or the action mechanics on different cards. You get the different synergies between cards and between regions. For instance, you get the possibility to put additional influence in the Baltic Sea or in Poland by using a Czech card, showing you the connections, showing you the different animosities or friendship between regions and nations. And this is also a way to recreate the events, a way to tell us the story how the struggle between Russia and Europe evolved, and I like it a lot. What I really like is also the fact that you get several ways to score points, not only by scoring headlines, but you still have to be very careful about placing your dice and about upgrading them to the maximum number, so to 6, because this also grants you points. And sometimes when you see that you won't be able to score a headline, your best way is to stop your opponent from scoring his own, or acquire new points by upgrading your dice, which finally at the middle and at the game's end will give you additional points. So I like this a lot, plus the advantage cards, which also can be a tiebreaker, because keeping those cards will give you valuable points, and very often the game will be decided by 1 or 2 points, so those additional points from advantage cards can also mean winning or losing. I very highly rate this game in terms of replay value, because I believe that due to several factors, this will be a game with a huge replay value. It starts from the game setup, when you randomly remove a certain number of headline cards from the game. Then it passes through the random distribution of cards that you will be using. Then it also is the games will be differentiated by the different advantage cards that you will be drawing. So each game will look differently. And of course, there will be some pretty obvious regions where you should be present, expecting some cards to be put into play and enable you to score. But sometimes, even with, for instance, 4 or 5 cards which are related to Poland or to the Balkans, none of them will appear, because some of them might be could have been removed while preparing the game. Others will be, for instance, drawn by your opponent and he won't be placing them. He will be keeping them and then discarding during the game. So the replay value of this title is really huge. So what are the weaker points of this title? I have already said a few words about the functional aspect of the part of the board, where in my opinion you really have a lot of things going on in a very small space, and this tends to become a part of the board where things are crowded. I would prefer this to be put into another sector, or maybe making this part of the board larger. What I didn't like during my plays was the fact that it happens that sometimes you get 3 headline cards related to your opponent, because at the game start you'll be having one headline which is always related to your own superpower, but then when drawing additional headlines from the deck, it might happen, and it happens, that you get, for instance, 3 headline cards related to your opponent. And this doesn't mean that your opponent is holding 3 headlines associated to your superpower. He can have, for instance, 2 of them and 1 related to his own. Obviously, he'll be placing his own headline, while you will have to choose from those 3 opponent's headlines 1 which in your opinion will be the most difficult to accomplish. So sometimes you will have to choose headlines and make actions not to score points, but to forbid your opponent from scoring points. And you might call it a strategy, you might call it a way, a different approach to the Cold War struggle. But I'd prefer a situation in which you could try to accomplish your own headline, at the same time trying to stop your opponents from accomplishing his. Now, there happened games when I had 3 headlines related to my opponent, while he had one of his headlines related to his own superpower, and believe me, it was much easier from his perspective to play, because he had a bigger opportunity to score additional points. When these situations happen, the scores tend to be much smaller. There won't be 22, 23 points for one side. You'll end the game, for instance, having 15 or 16 points. It's not a big issue, it's not a problem with the mechanics, but I believe that sometimes it can influence the final outcome of the game, and I'd prefer that, for instance, you could have a possibility when having 3 headlines of your opponent to reshuffle them into the deck and draw new once per game, for instance, or use your cards, your action or advantage cards, enabling you to switch a headline card. Maybe something of maybe something similar to such actions could enable to totally eradicate this problem. Having said that, I believe that Europe Divided is a very interesting game, a very intense game, a game in which you will be very often head to head and the final scores will be very close one to the other, a game in which you will be really feeling this new Cold War theme, in which, in my opinion, the mechanics were very well tailored to simulate this conflict, in which at the same time we have a huge replay value. A game very interesting not only for Twilight Struggle fans, but for people who like asymmetrical 2-player games, in which you will have to really think a lot about how to best use your cards and how to expand, at the same time how to find a limit and a balance between expanding and having an efficient deck. So there are a lot of factors that you should consider while playing your turn. Not only placing dice and accumulating points is key to victory, it is also knowing how to keep your deck strong, and this is also a very important aspect of Europe Divided. So if you have the opportunity, try this game because it is a very good game. This was a review of Europe Divided from Phalanx. I invite you to take a look at our other videos, at our reviews, at our unboxings. Have a fantastic day and see you next time.